Hi, I'm Renée Thornton, and I'm chair of the Wild Sheep Foundation's Women Hunt program. It's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Becky Humphries, CEO of the National Wild Turkey Federation, one of the fastest growing and most effective conservation organizations in our community. She's going to share with us a system or model based on principles that led to a wildlife success story that is the envy of the world. How do we achieve the miraculous comeback of North America's wildlife from extinction of some to near extinction of many species by the late 1800s? There were many factors that led to the decline of wildlife and habitat in Canada, Mexico, and the United States. But let's be clear, while overharvest and market hunting played a role, irresponsible land use practices, disease passed from domestic stock to wildlife, competition for forage, and lack of wildlife management science and policies played an even greater role. What we now call the North American Wildlife Conservation Model is based not on absolute mechanisms for the recovery of wildlife, but 7 principles which represent what is believed is the proper and sustainable treatment of wildlife. As Ms. Humphries covers what are called the 7 sisters or 7 pillars of the model, I ask that you think on how these principles align with your beliefs. They're the bedrock of one of the most incredible reversals of fortune in history and one of the most successful systems and models devised by woman or man. Please enjoy this presentation by one of the most articulate scholars and professionals in wildlife conservation.
Hello, I'm Becky Humphries, CEO of the National Wild Turkey Federation. And it's my pleasure and honor to be with you today and speak to you on 2 topics that are near and dear to me. The first is history of conservation and the important role that women played in that history. And it's also to talk to you about the North American model of wildlife conservation and tell you a little about the leaders of that time, a few of the women leaders who are rarely mentioned in books and novels that we read about, and give you their perspective on the North American model of conservation. So sit back, relax, and I hope this walk through time will be enjoyable for you. The conservation movement in the United States started in the 19th century. It came at a time when we had been harvesting resources at really an alarming rate, a time where the quality of life in our American cities was declining. Market hunting was big business in the United States, and we harvested the giant white pines of the North and the Midwest, the longleaf pines of the South, and the sequoias of the West at an alarming rate. Our railroads that carried this precious fiber resource also carried saddles of venison, barrels of passenger pigeon, and salted fish in huge quantities to our cities. Men's beaver skin hats and women's hats wore plumage of whole birds and that feather that was so popular following the Civil War. The age of conservation came in the late 1900s, and it was coupled with what we call the progressive movement. Child labor laws, women's suffragette movements, drug and safety movements, and wildlife conservation all came into being during this time. I suspect many of you have heard the names of the male icons of the conservation movement. Teddy Roosevelt comes to most people's minds as the front runner. Teddy lost both his mother and his wife on the same day when he was still a young man. Distraught, he traveled west and spent several years on the western frontier, finding himself and shaping his views on conservation. Gifford Pinchot was his very good friend and the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service. Together they worked tirelessly to shape what we now know as the U.S. Forest Service and our national forest system. Other icons included John Muir and later Aldo Leopold. However, there were many individuals who also worked long and hard and were instrumental. The General Federation of Women's Clubs was founded in 1890. These women's clubs were the result of middle and upper class married women who had leisure time, financial resources, and saw it as their place to clean up the mess that was beginning to become prevalent in our cities across the United States. Mrs. Lydia Adams Williams was a feminist conservation writer and a member of the Women's National Press Association, and she was particularly vociferous in her efforts to popularize women's accomplishments. In her article, Conservation, Women's Work, she complained that man has become too busy building railroads, constructing ships, engineering great projects, and exploring vast commercial enterprises to consider the future. Man, the maker, had left it to woman, the money saver, to preserve the resources and place women squarely in the conservation movement. The Women's Federation had chapters in every state as they selected knowledgeable women on forestry issues to lead forestry committees in each of those states. These committees led efforts to reduce paper waste, to pick up trash, and to beautify communities by planting trees and shrubs. And these groups had enormous impacts on both state and national conservation efforts. In California, Mrs. Lovell White started the California Federation of Women's Clubs out of her home in 1906. She, along with several other leaders, led a sustained effort on over several decades, to ultimately lead for the protection of the giant sequoias, and through federal legislation, the creation of a national park. In 1903, this group also drew up a bill to establish the School of Forestry at the University of California, Berkeley. Up until that time, the nation's only 3 forestry schools were located in the eastern United States. In Minnesota, Mrs. Lydia Phillips led the Minnesota Federation of Women's Clubs to repeal the Dead and Down Timber Act and to save what became the Chippewa Forest Reserve, now known as the Chippewa National Forest. Efforts in other states led to forest reserves in New Hampshire, in Florida, Louisiana, and 36 other states. Mrs. Myra Lloyd Dodd presented a paper on forestry at the Federation meeting in Pennsylvania and later became the Pennsylvania Forestry Commissioner. In 1911, the Pennsylvania School of Horticulture for Women was founded, and Dr. Carolyn Rumbold from the University of Munich was named head of a special conservation Pennsylvania State Commission to eradicate chestnut blight with an annual operating budget of $275,000. Through these efforts and many more, the Pennsylvania Department of Forestry was eventually created. The General Federation began to play an important role in the national conservation movement by 1908, and the president of the Federation, Mrs. Sarah Platt Decker of Denver, was the only representative of the women's organization at the White House Governor's Conference on Conservation in 1908. She also attended the National Conservation Commission held in Washington in December of 1908 that was a follow-up to the Governor's Conference. In Louisiana, Mrs. John Wilkerson led an effort to create the Weeks Bill to create for the protection of watersheds for navigable streams. In 1908, the Women's National Rivers and Harbors Conference was held in Shreveport, Louisiana. What started out as a group of several hundred women grew to a group of over 30,000 women and a few men by 1910. The group advocated for clean shores and streams, conservation in schools, and helped pass protection of Niagara Falls in 1909. Similarly, the Daughters of the American Revolution started conservation committees and pushed for conservation legislation. In 1909, Mrs. Matthew T. Scott was elected president of the Daughters of the American Revolution. She started a conservation committee made up of 100 women representing all 50 states. The chair of the conservation committee was Mrs. James Pinchot, mother of Gifford Pinchot. And in 1909, Gifford Pinchot spoke at the National DAR Convention and thanked the group for their leadership on the Alaska Coal Bill, grazing legislation, and urged the group to take up water issues. Water conservation advocates spoke on the conservation ethic as the trilogy: conservation of true womanhood, conservation of the home, and conservation of children. I suspect many of you know about the movement to ban the use of feathers for women's hats, known as the Audubon movement. This struggle eventually led to the passage of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Tariff Act of 1913, which banned the import of feathers into the U.S. What you might not know is that women led much of this effort. In 1883 and 1884, Field and Stream published a series of articles calling out the tragedy of rapidly declining bird populations. In 1886, the American Ornithologist prepared a bulletin supplement for the publication Science. 100,000 copies were printed and provided suggested wording for a model law to be passed in each state. The first Audubon societies were started in 1886, and they grew to 30,000 members in just 6 months. Audubon magazine was first published in 1887, and women started chapters in many states. The founders of the Smith College chapter started the idea of birding trips to take women to see live birds, and thus create awareness. Later, the women presidents of both Radcliffe and Wesley colleges joined their voices to the effort, and by 1905, 35% of the Audubon members were women, and by 1915, it had increased to over 50%. By 1905, 28 states had passed model laws protecting birds. However, the resurgence in the use of imported bird feathers arose, and a call to women conservationists to redouble their efforts occurred. In 1913, the Tariff Act was passed, closing the borders of the United States to imported bird feathers. The women's suffrage movement and the conservation movement were really linked. Women had developed real influence in helping pass national laws to protect and create special places we now know as Yellowstone, Yosemite, and they helped create the National Park Service and the National Forest Service, as well as many state agencies. However, as these agencies were formed, we grew into an age of technical expertise, and women's roles were cast aside. At the 1913 Conservation Congress, only one woman spoke, and she was from the American Red Cross. Many of the early women leaders were not invited to forums on conservation, and conservation grew into a male occupation and advocation. Despite these shifts, there were women leaders then, and there are many more today. Recent surveys of university programs show over 50% of the graduates are women in fields such as fisheries, wildlife, zoology, and forestry. However, these are recent trends. When I graduated with my Bachelor of Science in Wildlife, there were only 4 of us in my class of over 400. And my professors actually told me I would never find employment. That one professor did more to motivate me than all my other instructors combined. And one of my only regrets is he passed away before I became the agency's state director. But this history brings us so much understanding and background into what we call the North American model of wildlife conservation. Our natural resources, including wildlife, represent the health and wealth of our country and our people. We're extremely fortunate in North America to have a proven system that not only recognizes these values, but provides for and directs the proper use and management of these natural resources that we hold near and dear. The North American model of conservation is anchored by the Supreme Court decision that decreed wildlife belongs to the people and not the government, not corporations or individuals. It further directs how these natural resources are to be used and managed under sustainable guidelines for the betterment of both wildlife and people. It is the reason we still have abundant wildlife populations in the U.S. and the opportunity to freely hunt and fish the sustainable surplus or enjoy wildlife, each in our own way. The model is guided by 7 principles, sometimes referred to as the 7 Sisters. It's developed over time, out of necessity, to reverse the negative effects from the unregulated overharvest of many species of wildlife and early attitudes that these resources were there for the taking and were inexhaustible. Sportsmen and women, led by the Boone and Crockett Club, and many of the women leaders I've already mentioned, helped to either establish, popularize, mobilize support for, or defend each of these guiding principles over the past 125 years. Teddy Roosevelt founded the Boone and Crockett Club, and its early members, who were all male, included many of the conservation leaders. Today, there are both men and women members of the club, and the results of the club and all these efforts that I've summarized earlier are unprecedented in the history of mankind. The 7 tenets of the model include public trust. Public trust says that wildlife belongs to the people and managed for the trust of the people by government agency. Who owns wildlife was determined by a Supreme Court decision at the time the New World was flexing its independence from European rule. The public trust doctrine is the pillar of North American conservation, but it took time for our citizens to fully understand the responsibilities that came with this ownership. Many of the leaders of the early conservation movement focused their efforts on awakening the people to the plight of our wildlife, our resources, and that those resources did indeed belong to them, but were in their care. Once the public realized it was their wildlife being irresponsibly eliminated, their outcry was so great that conservation legislation was passed. The second tenet is a prohibition on the commerce of dead wildlife. This really put an end to market hunting. It is illegal to sell the meat of any wild animal in North America. Market hunting contributed greatly to the extinction of some species of wildlife and the near extinction of others. In many states, such as my home state of Michigan, the lumber camps had also shipped game meat to Chicago. And with the Boone and Crockett Club rallying the public and political support needed, the club member, Senator John F. Lacey of Iowa, was able to present and pass the Lacey Acts of 1900 and 1907. The act prohibited the commercial value of wild game meat, selling the end of market hunting, and allowing our wildlife to recover and to flourish. The third tenet is the allocation of wildlife by law. Laws developed by people and enforced by government agencies will regulate the proper use of wildlife resources. The mere presence of man on the landscape can negatively affect wildlife and the habitats that support them. The rule of law, instead of the rule of chance, is used to govern the appropriate use of wildlife resources. Conservation leaders proposed laws and rallied public support for these new rules of order. Government agencies such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Forest Service were established to oversee the proper execution and enforcement of these laws. And the Boone and Crockett Club's Fair Chase Statement also became the cornerstone for game laws established by the states. The next tenet is our opportunity for all. Every citizen has the freedom to hunt and fish. Public access to wildlife, regardless of social or economic status, including hunting, fishing, and trapping, is a right of citizenship. This access fosters individual stewardship and provides the funding necessary to properly manage wildlife resources in a sustainable manner. Theodore Roosevelt believed strongly in wise use conservation and fought aggressively against preservationist or non-use proposals. This separation of conservation from preservation was and is a real and bitter divide in groups even today. The club also believed that those who use the resource should pay for its care and for its maintenance, and the club lobbied for laws and institutions that provided for this funding, including a federal excise tax on sporting arms and ammunition and the federal duck stamp program. Sportsmen and women subsequently stepped forward and gladly accepted their role in funding conservation. Non-frivolous use is our next tenet. In North America, we can legally kill certain wildlife for legitimate purposes under strict guidelines for food and fur, in self-defense, or to properly protect our property. Regulations are in place to protect against casual killing and wanton waste, the mistreating of wildlife. The rules of proper use, both in written law and personal ethics, did not exist in the commercial market and in many subsistence hunting cultures. As these activities faded, what remained was recreational or sport hunting. What separated a true sportsman from market hunters was an ethical code of defined personal conduct. These same tenets of fair chase were used as the cornerstone of modern day game laws. Club member Aldo Leopold is credited with framing the concept of a land ethic and managing the entire biotic communities. Combined, these became the foundation for the proper use of nature, ecosystems, and biotic communities of which all wildlife and man belong and are managed under the knowledge of science rather than opinion or conjecture. Wildlife and the habitats that support them was put in place to support conservation defined by the club member George Bird Grinnell as wise use without waste. Our next tenet is international resources. Because wildlife and fish freely migrate across boundaries, between states and provinces, and even countries, they are considered international resource. The proper management of certain species of migrating wildlife are to be managed by international treaties and laws. Sportsmen were among the very first to recognize the need for international treaties and laws to save what was left of decimated waterfowl populations. Waterfowl that nested in Canada and Alaska and the lower 48 states and then migrated as far south as Mexico could only be saved if restrictions to their loss of their wetland nesting habitats and hunting reached across international boundaries. The National Refuge System was created in 1903, and the passage of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1913 and 1917, and the Reclamation Act of 1902, and the Migratory Bird Conservation Act of 1929 all contributed to the recovery and future prosperity of migratory species. Managed by science. The best science available will be used as a base for informed decision-making in wildlife management. Theodore Roosevelt and many of the conservation leaders, the female leaders I mentioned earlier, were strong advocates of science, and that only the best science available was to be used to make critical decisions on natural resource management. The club began by providing seed money for some of the first wildlife research projects across the country. Under the leadership of member Aldo Leopold, the club began formulating flexible scientific management policies for wildlife and natural resources to achieve an ecological balance. The club also called for the President's first conference on outdoor recreation, which led to establishment of the National Recreation Policy Act, which coordinated resource management at federal, state, and local levels. The North American model is sometimes confused with the conservation funding model in the United States. While not the same, they are linked. The user pay concept grew out of the conservation movement, and 80% of wildlife conservation funding is paid by users. Hunting and fishing license revenue and the excise taxes on guns, ammunition, and our equipment. With almost a century of user pay, we are now beginning to see declining hunter numbers, and we have yet to establish another long-term alternative funding model. However, we are seeing real growth in the number of female hunters. The last overall national survey of hunters showed over a 10% growth in the number of female hunters. And likewise, recreational shooting has dramatically increased. Today, over 75% of the money From the excise taxes on sporting arms and ammunition that support conservation come from shooting. So how will we manage this tremendous need of the species at risk in the future? The risks are more than declining habitat, drought and climate change, and commercialization. As we demand more and more from our landscapes, we are positioning wildlife, people, and livestock in close proximity. We are moving animals not only across the nation, but around the world, increasing the risk of disease and destruction. Just as our mothers and forefathers learned, the first step is public awareness. Now it's our turn, and for us to address the needs of wildlife in our landscapes. I hope my children's children will talk about our leadership and that we created solutions to fit fish and wildlife into our working landscapes, and that they think of us as leaders in our time. Thank you for your time and attention, and thank you for your dedication to conservation.